Local Government and Administrative Decentralization, Lecture 1. We now move to a series of lectures about Tocqueville's account of local government and the general decentralization of governmental power in the United States, and his argument for why that's a good thing. Before we move on to a series of lectures on his concept of individualism, which he believes is a dangerous thing in a democratic society, and how Americans combat individualism, and then also his account of a particular form of democratic despotism that he's afraid might emerge in the future, and what can be done to prevent it. Now, in the in-person version of this class, the material that I'm lecturing on right now, local government and administrative decentralization, comes earlier in the class. So I teach it in this online version. I'm putting it with some other Tocqueville readings just to make all the Tocqueville readings come together. So I'm shifting the order a little bit. And the reason why I mention that is because that means there might be some overlap between what I say in these lectures and what I say in the next Tocqueville lectures on individualism and all of that, because those lectures were recorded at a different time. And those lectures the lecture that I'm delivering now is not actually written to go immediately before these other ones. So there might be some overlap. I apologize for that. It's all, I think, worth hearing anyways. Tocqueville, this chapter, which comes in part 1 of Democracy in America, and again, I'm using this version. And in this abridged version, it comes in on page 44, which is Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 5, which is entitled The Necessity of Studying What Happens Within the Particular States Before Discussing the Government of the Union. And Tocqueville's point is that you can't really understand American politics if you only study the federal government. That's obviously what I've focused on in this class. But his point is that a lot of the political life of the nation resides actually not even at the state level, it resides at the local level, that a lot of actual governing, a lot of actual deliberation about the public good and the carrying out of those deliberations happens at the local level in local government. And so you can't really understand the democratic and political character of American society if you only look to the top. In fact, you really need to look down at the foundation in local government. And so in this, although this is abridged, in this chapter as a whole, he talks about local government, which in the translation he calls municipal government. So you're talking about towns and cities. Then he also talks about counties, which is the next layer up of organization. And he talks about state governments. And then he moves on to talking about the federal government. So you have kind of multiple layers, starting at the local level, the county level, the state level, and the national level. And he says a lot of the life of the nation is really at the municipal level, the local level, state, where you have towns and cities. And the main thing I want to impress upon you in this discussion is that Tocqueville actually argues that in order for a democratic people to be truly free, it needs to have a lot of vigorous local government where ordinary people can participate in the governing of their communities. So for Tocqueville, vigorous, active, and powerful local government is necessary for maintaining freedom in a democratic society. Although he doesn't really say what liberty is, but what the way I would put it is that for Tocqueville, freedom really consists in not only being in charge of yourself, but also having some responsibility for making the decisions that affect the broader community that you live in. So you're not just free in your private life in the sense of doing what you want in your private time with your time and your money and all that kind of stuff, but you're also free in the more literal sense of being part of a community that governs itself, where you participate in that self-government. So you make decisions not only about your private life, but you contribute to the making of decisions about public life as well, with all the virtues that requires. That requires patriotism, and it requires industriousness, it requires courage. So all these virtues of the human soul that are really best sort of cultivated, according to Tocqueville, through the exercising of public responsibility. So if you want people to be truly free and self-governing, you have to give them the opportunity to govern themselves. And for most ordinary people, the only level where that's really possible is at the local level. So if you want a genuinely free, self-governing people, you've got to give them a lot of local freedom to run their communities as they see fit. And that if you try to centralize power in the central government, you will actually destroy the freedom and even the spirit of freedom of the people, and you'll actually render people more servile and narrower. So that's his argument. So in this lecture, I'm going to take you through a brief tour of his account of life and government in the township. And then in the next lecture, I will talk about his account of what he calls administrative decentralization. So in other words, the importance of decentralization. So again, Tocqueville is talking about what we would call a town or a village. And he says real freedom at the level of a town or a city is pretty rare in human societies, that it's a natural form of society. When you look at any human society, or at least any post-agricultural revolution society, you find that people live in towns, they live in villages, they live in cities. That's very natural. But by and large, those towns and cities or villages are dominated by some higher power. They don't govern themselves very much. That's his argument. And he says, and the reason why is because they're small. They're just not powerful enough to resist. So once a larger power is there, it can kind of just run the show. And the townships really aren't powerful enough to resist. But he argues that, in fact, nonetheless, it is the townships where real freedom resides. It's in the towns and in the cities. If you want a free society, you've got to have freedom there. And the way he puts it is this, near the bottom of page 46. It is, however, in the municipality, the town or the city, that the strength of free peoples resides. Municipal institutions are to liberty what primary schools are to knowledge. They place it within reach of the people. They give them the experience of the peaceful exercise of it and habituate them to make use of it. Without municipal institutions, a nation may give itself a free government, but it does not have a spirit of liberty. So townships give America its spirit of freedom. Just because everybody has an equal vote and can cast that vote every few years doesn't really mean you have the spirit of freedom, the spirit of having the capacity and the disposition to take responsibility for the community and to govern yourself, right? Just because you can cast a vote every 4 years doesn't really mean you're self-governing, and still be the case that most of the time you're still just doing what you're told. So the spirit of liberty, the spirit of self-government resides in the township. That's where you get the real experience of what it means to be self-governing. And as he says, it's like they're primary schools of freedom. And the analogy here, the idea is obviously when you go to elementary school, you're not really learning very intricate science. You're not learning the cutting edge of any discipline. You're learning just sort of the basic building blocks of a bunch of different disciplines in a way that's accessible to children. Nonetheless, that primary school, you need to pass through that stage if you're ever going to make it to any more advanced stage, right? So a nation without primary schools is going to be a nation without scientists, even though you don't really learn science in primary school. So his point is, in the same way, it is at the local level that ordinary people can get that actual primary experience of what it means to do things like attend a meeting, speak at a meeting, run a committee, deliberate about a matter of public affairs, weigh alternatives, assess other people's opinions, propose legislation, debate legislation, all those, the actual activity of governing. The only place where ordinary people are going to get the experience of that, learn how to do it, and become disposed to do it, is going to be at the local level. Because, most of us ordinary people, we can't just fly off to Washington, D.C. and be part of the central government, right? We are, when it comes to national politics, your average citizen is merely a spectator. You're in the stands, maybe, watching the game, but there are a very small number of people who are actually on the field playing the game. Right? When it comes to what goes on in DC, most Americans have zero access and zero influence there. We're spectators. We might cheer, we might boo, we might root for one side instead of another side, but we're still just up there in the bleachers. We're not on the field. At the local level, though, you can be on the field. You can actually be a part of the governing. Even ordinary people, even people who have a day job and have kids, can still find the time to participate in local politics and thereby gain the experience needed to be responsibly self-governing. So that's what he means by they're the primary schools, is where people learn how to be free. You don't learn how to be free by watching, DC government in action on C-SPAN. You learn how to be free by engaging in the activity of government. And the only place you have access to that activity is at the local level. And he especially focuses on the townships in New England. He says it's really New England where this was perfected. So he talks about a few things. He talks about the size of the township, that it's small enough that there can be a lively sense of common belonging, a lively sense of community, like this is my town, but big enough that you've got a genuine talent pool. So you've got people who can actually do a good job of running the place. And then he talks about how townships are governed. And, on the one hand, so you've got selectmen in a lot of these places who are elected annually and who are ultimately in charge of administering the government. So they kind of make up the executive branch in charge of administering government, and they're accompanied by roughly 18 other officers at this time, according to Tocqueville: tax assessors, tax collectors, the school board, the sheriff, the county clerk, the county treasurers, all these various public functionaries that kind of administer government day to day. Now, what about the legislative branch? There isn't one. It's the town meeting, because the officers that oversee the government, they actually have quite limited discretion. Almost every important matter of the community is put to a vote, and it's not a vote by representatives of the community, but the community itself. It's assembly democracy, like with the Puritans. So citizens assemble and deliberate and make decisions together. They don't do it through a medium of representatives. This is real democracy in action. It is the most democratic area of American life, right? Because it's, as I said, it's actually possible for most citizens to participate in local government, to go to town meetings, to speak from the floor, to run for city council, to help somebody else run for city council, all those kinds of things. You can do that in your town. You can't do that in DC, but you can do that in your town. As I said before, you can be on the field. And so, for him, that's one of the most remarkable thing about these towns is that, they are actually self-governing communities where the citizens participate in the decision making instead of even their representatives. They themselves do it. And he goes on to kind of talk about as this is translated, the sort of like the municipality as an individual entity. Just basically what he means by that is he's talking about the kind of communities they are. Because the point is for him is that these self-governing towns, they have a real identity. People are kind of proud of their towns. They think of themselves as belonging to this particular town. It's not just a geographic location where they happen to grow up and live. It is a living community of people in a particular place that they belong to, that they have a sense of strong belonging to. And he says that, in these communities, because these communities are sort of experienced as living independent communities that run their own affairs, you have this very lively sense in America that, properly speaking, political power is not something that flows from the top down. It's something that flows from the bottom up. That the governing assumption in democratic life in America is that in most matters, individuals are competent to run their own affairs as individuals. Nonetheless, there are, of course, times when individuals have to work together, right? There are times when a higher authority is needed. As he mentions, when individuals have done something bad and they need to be punished, that's where you look to government. But also there are times where there are things for the public good that individuals can't necessarily accomplish on their own, where citizens have to cooperate together in order to achieve them. And that's where, in the first instance, the township comes in. So people see, yes, this, local government is really important to me. There are good things in my life that I need and that I cannot have access to unless I work together with my fellow citizens to provide them. So, good roads, good schools, communal celebrations, various things like that. So there's a sense that, for the most part, in my private life, I'm in charge of myself and I'm a good judge of my own affairs. But there are areas where, we really need one another as a community. And so in those areas where we need one another, we come together and we work together collectively at the local level. And then he mentions there's some things that really can't even be competently done by the local level. And so that's kind of where the county comes in, for example, with running the courts, the local court system and things like that. There's not the same sense of lively belonging to a county. Lots and lots of people, even to this day, have a kind of patriotic feeling towards their hometown. But very few people have that same feeling towards their home county, right? Because the county is really just sort of an administrative unit. It's not really kind of like a unitary entity that people feel a part of. But still, counties do certain things, and there are certain things that transcend even the ability of counties to take care of on their own, and that's where the state government comes in. And of course, as we talked about before, there are certain things that even state governments aren't competent doing, and that's where the national government comes in. But Tocqueville's point is that there's this palpable experience in America at his time of power flowing upwards. So that instead of the presumption being the government's in charge of everything, and if it just happens to let us do a few things here and there, that's great. But ultimately, the central government's in charge of everything. No, the idea rather is authority is delegated upwards as needed. So there are certain things where, we need our local government. And so our local government legitimately exercises authority there. And we have a share in that, right? Because we are self-governing communities. And so we like that. And we exercise our own talents through kind of serving our neighbors and serving and trying to guide our community. And so people, they like that. There are things that our town can't do. And so for that, we look to higher authority. We delegate power upwards, but only the power that's really needed. Because ultimately it's the people who are sovereign. So this idea of political power flowing up, this embodies the notion of popular sovereignty, and it's really kind of captured in this preference for local self-government rather than being governed by some distant entity. And so, as he says, Americans become very attached to their townships, to their municipalities, because they actually feel themselves a part of a larger community that they can make valuable contributions to. And people like that. That is moving to people. Hey, I'm part of something bigger than myself. It's something that I can make a difference in, right? It's something that I can contribute to. And so that generates a sense of loyalty. As he says, it generates a feeling somewhat similar to the way that people are kind of proud and attached to their families, right? In some ways, it's almost an extension of self-love. I love this thing that I'm a part of because I'm an important part of it, but it still gives you a broader view of things. It makes you more public-spirited, and that's ultimately his point in this discussion and in the discussion of administrative decentralization, is that Americans are very, very concerned about the public good. They don't just selfishly pay attention to their own private affairs. They are actively disposed to be thinking about what would be good for my town, what would be good for my state, what would be good for my country, and what can I do about it? Not sitting back and saying, boy, somebody else should take care of that, but what can I do to serve my community? And he says that is just, again, in the America of his time, is just an innate disposition in citizens. And the reason why it is because they're given the opportunity to act on it. They're not just told what to do all the time. They can have an effect. They can participate in the governing of their own communities. And so by being given the opportunity to care for the common good, they learn to care for it and want to care for it. They develop a sense of patriotism that moves them to exert themselves on the part of the larger whole. And as Tocqueville says, there are really only kind of two things that really move people to make great sacrifices for the larger good, right? According to him. He says there's patriotism and there's religion. Those are really, those are the two causes. I think you could add other causes to that. But, the idea is you have to have some cause that you feel you can make a difference to. And so, and the way you do that, again, then the way you have that care and that concern for something is partly because you believe that you actually have the power to make a contribution. And so, as he says, in a country where people have no power to make any difference, to contribute to the governing, they tend to be less patriotic, and they tend to not really have that much concern for the broader public good, because they've been kind of habituated to think that's somebody else's business. The government's in charge of that. It's not me. I just live my life, but the roads, the schools, that's somebody else's job, right? And so people who think that way are not going to be disposed to take the initiative for their country. But of course, the reason why is because they haven't been given the opportunity to take the initiative, because the rulers just say, shut up and do what we say. So if the people in charge of the public good say, shut up and do what we say long enough, then the ordinary population is going to be like, yeah, that's no business of mine. I'm just going to attend to my own affairs. Whereas in America, since people have the opportunity to contribute, to participate, to care for the public good, they develop the habitual disposition to do so. Now he says, look, um, that doesn't mean that, local government is always the most competent. He thinks in general there's more concern for the public good in America. But, some towns do a better job than others. He's not saying everything's perfect. He's not saying everything's perfectly efficient. He basically says if efficiency is what you're concerned about, then you should have the central authority in charge of everything. Get the experts together, make a uniform policy. So if what you're concerned about is comfort and efficiency and things like that, then you don't need local freedom. What local freedom contributes to is actually having a patriotic citizenry that exerts itself on behalf of the public good. And Tocqueville's point is, at the end of the day, having a citizenry that cares deeply about the good of their community and the good of their country is way more important than just having efficient, public health policies or something like that. Freedom is more important than efficiency. And the way to get freedom is by having local freedom. So that's why townships are so important. But this discussion of local, this discussion of local freedom at the township level then provides within the chapter later a segue to his general discussion of what he calls administrative decentralization. The fact that political power, broadly speaking, is decentralized in the United States. That there's a lot of power at the local level and at the state level. It's not just all held by the central government. And Tocqueville thinks that administrative decentralization, the decentralization of political power, is absolutely essential for maintaining freedom in a democracy. So that's what we'll get to in the next lecture.